Howard's wing was turning left and coming back down here. So this afternoon, the fighting is transitioning much farther down the old Goldsboro Road. And actually, General Johnson's pulling Hoke's division back to ultimately become like a horseshoe position north of the road for the next 2 days. This is where our junior reserves, our young 16 to 17-year-old boys, and I'll talk about them a little bit here shortly, they're playing a little key part here this afternoon as well. But this afternoon, my lecture is on the Battle of Wyse's Forks. Now, I'm standing in a Confederate uniform, and I was actually the number 2 man on a light field piece, a 3-inch ordnance rifle, a while ago that many of y'all saw on the demonstration. Notice my uniform, you notice the red hat. Red normally signifies an artilleryman during the Civil War, just like today's Army, same way with artillery. Sometimes they're called redlegs because of the red stripe on their leg. But in 1865, we had this term called red infantry because the guns down at Fort Fisher and Fort Anderson and around Charleston and Savannah, a lot of the big sea-coastal artillery pieces, when these forts fell, those artillerymen really didn't have a job anymore. So the Confederacy's looking for infantry in the field, hence the term red infantry you'll hear used quite often, quite frequently here in the Carolinas campaign in 1865. Here in North Carolina, we have our young Confederate artillerymen from Fort Fisher, Fort Anderson, that area along the Cape Fear River defenses, but then also coming up from South Carolina with General Hardee's force as well. Now today I'm going to talk about the Battle of Wyse's Forks, which occurs in March of 1865. The subject of my most recent book here, which we have on sale here at the Visitor Center. If you don't mind, please, I'm going to kind of get semi out of uniform here. Excuse me, because I have been in the field. I like to begin the story with young Sergeant William Trusdale, a young 22-year-old Tennessean who's basically survived 4 years of war, a stint as a federal prisoner, as a Confederate prisoner. He's paroled after Vicksburg, survives the bloody battles during the Atlanta campaign, also Hood's Tennessee campaign in November and December of 1864. But on January 27, 1865, in Tupelo, Mississippi, Sergeant Trusdale will board trains along with other members of the Confederate Army of Tennessee, and they will begin a long journey through the Deep South, up through the Carolinas, and on the morning of March 10th, in Kinston, North Carolina, Sergeant Trusdale's train will pull in just as the sun is rising in the east, and Trusdale and his comrades, they will detrain and march out to the battlefield where they hear the sounds of guns and musketry fire. Now, unfortunately for Trusdale, that would be the last sunrise on earth he will ever witness. Several hours later, he's shot through the neck, killed instantly. Unfortunately, his 2 older brothers who were serving with him are unable to recover his body. And because of the flow of the battle and the fact that the Confederates give up the battlefield that afternoon to the Union forces, Trusdale still rests today somewhere in an unmarked grave, and we know through working with family history here, in an unmarked grave along Highway 70 between Kinston and Newbern. Now, Trusdale's story, to me, is somewhat symbolic in the battle itself. Because, see, the Battle of Wyse's Forks is the first of 4 major battles in North Carolina in March of 1865, all in a very short 12-day period. Wyse's Fork here to the east in Kinston, followed by the big cavalry battle in modern-day Fort Bragg, which was called Monroe's Crossroads. We have Avery'sboro on the 15th and 16th, and then where we're sitting today here on the Bentonville battlefield. 4 major battles, the first of ones. But it's been almost somewhat forgotten and almost relegated as a minor skirmish by contemporary historians. And I think what we bring out in this book is it's part of a much larger operation that's going to be happening here in eastern North Carolina. Because I like to point out, folks, in January 65, there's barely 12,000 Union soldiers in our state. But when Sherman's army comes across this line the first week of March, and all the reinforcements that General Grant's sending into Morehead City into the Wilmington area, by the first week of March, folks, there's over 90,000 Union soldiers in this state of North Carolina. is part of a much larger operation. These railroads right here from Wilmington to Goldsboro and from Morehead City to Goldsboro are key to Sherman's operations. And all this right here is part of what he called to prepare for my coming. Now here's the architect of the Carolinas campaign. Depending on what side of the fence you're on, he's a brilliant campaign strategist. Never won a battle, but he's never lost a campaign. Or he could be on the other side of the fence where he's the devil incarnate, depending on where you're from. But in December of 1864, Major General William Tecumseh Sherman presented the city of Savannah, Georgia to Abraham Lincoln as a Christmas gift. And then the question became what to do with 60,000 hardened veterans. Where are we going to go next? There's no really Confederate army in Georgia to confront them. Sherman's boss, Ulysses S. Grant, who will pop up here in a second, wanted Sherman's army moved north up to Virginia because there's been a bloody stalemate around Richmond and Petersburg with Confederate General Robert E. Lee. So Grant wants 60,000 men immediately sent to Virginia to help turn the tide against Bobby Lee. But there's simply not enough naval or contracted vessels to move that many men that quickly to Virginia. So Sherman will propose to Grant, let me march my army north through the Carolinas. And when I do that, I will destroy anything and everything of military value that sustains the Confederate war effort. A railroad, an arsenal, a mill. I don't like newspapers, so I'm going to destroy them too. Okay, so there's that impact. But more importantly, folks, is the psychological impact that by marching an army pretty much unmolested through enemy territory, the young sons and men and brothers and husbands and stuff that are serving in Robert E. Lee's army around Petersburg and Virginia, their mamas and sisters and wives are writing them saying, hey, you need to come home. There's this army marching through, just ravaging the countryside. We're going to go hungry right now because this men came in and took everything we had food-wise. So it has that kind of psychological impact. But by bottom line, Sherman gets approval. And on the first week of February, he will begin his march north. Now, as I mentioned before, to Sherman, this is Goldsboro, North Carolina, about 3 or 4 years after the war. But what's important here, this first railroad right here, is the Atlantic and North Carolina Railroad that runs all the way down to Morehead City. Morehead City's a port. Here's the Wilmington and Weldon Railroad, which runs south down to Goldsboro. You see, these operations here in eastern North Carolina, and really what this book is all about, from the Union side, it's all for the want of a railroad. Sherman needs one of these railroads to the port so the Navy and the Quartermaster Corps can resupply him in Goldsboro. Now, here's Sherman coming up to Savannah. He's going to be shadowed by General Hardee out of Charleston, Confederate commanders here. You also down around Wilmington, all of a sudden Wilmington's the focus to General Grant. You have the operations to capture Fort Fisher in mid-January, and by 22 February, Wilmington will have been captured. But here's Confederate forces under General Bragg and Hope moving